At this time, the chair recognizes Councilwoman Gim, who will present a resolution declaring March 31st Transgender Day of Visibility. With Sharon Cooks and those accompanying her, please join the Councilwoman at the podium. And joining the Councilwoman, we have Councilman Greenlee, Councilwoman Blackwell, Councilwoman Reynolds-Brown, Councilman HENON, Councilwoman Parker, and Councilman Green, Councilwoman Bass, Councilman SQUILLA, and Councilwoman Keona Sanchez.
I didn't remember it being said like that. Is everybody up? There are a couple of people back up. Nikki, do you want to come up? Oh, yeah, that would be great. That would be wonderful. I might be kind of short. Don't rain on my parade, Councilman. Don't rain on my parade. Okay. Great. Thank you, everybody. We are gathered here today to celebrate the humanity, beauty, and achievements of trans people in Philadelphia and across the country. The public conversations we so often have about trans people is too often driven by stereotypes and heartbreaking stories of violence. But we know that trans people are our neighbors, our siblings, our parents, our children, our friends, our coworkers. We know that trans people are overcoming enormous challenges in their fight for freedom, dignity, and equality. This is what we honor and celebrate. As our resolution states, celebration does not equal justice. And for trans people, especially trans people and trans women of color, people who face daily threats, insufficient support, and the very real danger of transphobic violence and murder, justice is something that is sorely needed. I'm thinking about trans women of color who have been murdered in Philadelphia. Stacey Blahnik, Kyra Cordova, Nija Morris. They deserve justice, and they have not been given it for far too long. I'm thinking as well about the trans women of color who have been murdered since this year began. They too deserve justice. And I'm thinking of the generation of young trans people growing up in a time when bathroom bills and hate buses and political parties are sending messages of hate and rejection. We will reject this hate. We will stand up and fight back with our love, our dignity, and our community. And I want to thank especially the organizations who've been doing this work for a long time and who are here today. I want to especially acknowledge Amber Hikes, our new Executive Director of the Mayor's Commission on LGBT Affairs. I want to acknowledge my state representative, Brian Sims. We won't have to do the applause line for everybody, but we have a number of different organizations who are here, including William Way LGBT Community Center, LGBTQ Home of Hope, Morris Home, Galet, Black and Brown Workers Collective, Philadelphia Fight and Youth Health Empowerment Project, ACLU of Pennsylvania, the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia Sexuality and Gender Development Clinic, which serves more than 500 trans youth on the East Coast, Mazzoni Center, the University of Pennsylvania, the Friends Council on Education, and so many more. This is our community, this is our pride, this is our support and our center. And this year, City Council honors trans resistance and the deeply necessary work of mobilizing for justice in this moment, in this country, at this time. We are here to commit ourselves to standing with the trans community in joy and in pain, to celebrate and to fight and to persevere. And with that, we're going to start our resolution. So, declaring March 31st Transgender Day of Visibility in the City of Philadelphia. Whereas 1 million Americans are transgender and have bravely overcome significant hardships to build vibrant and thriving communities, often in the face of systemic and interpersonal prejudice, discrimination, and violence. And
whereas we cannot simply celebrate visibility without also recognizing that it does not always equal justice. Still, far too many trans people, in particular trans women of color, continue to face profound threats to their safety and well-being. And
whereas, already this year, we know of 8 trans women of color who were murdered. Jaquarius Helen, 18 years old. Sierra McElevin, 21 years old. China Gibson, 31 years old. Kiki Collier, 24 years old. Jojo Stryker, 23 years old. Misha Caldwell, 41 years old. Jamie Lee Wounded Arrow, 28 years old. And Alfonso Watson, 38 years old. For each trans person killed or lost this year, and in years past, we mourn, we honor, and we say their names. And
whereas we also celebrate the beauty and resilience of trans people through history and those who are with us today. And we recognize that trans people have contributed and continue to contribute in myriad ways to the betterment of our society and our city, often working at the forefront of social justice activism and human rights work. And
whereas trans people, and in particular trans women of color, including Sylvia Rivera, Miss Major, and Marsha P. Johnson, were instrumental in the creation of the modern gay rights movement in the United States. From the 1965 Dewey lunch counter protests in Philadelphia to the Stonewall riots in 1969 to the creation of radical civil rights organizations. And
whereas transgender, non-conforming Americans have made profound strides in challenging social and political norms that have forced many to live in secrecy regarding their gender identity, sentenced them to coercive medical and psychological treatments, and have denied them employment and housing opportunities. And
whereas civil rights victories won by trans activists have expanded judicial recognition of constitutional protections for gender identity and expression, and provided a greater number of people with the basic protections needed to ensure human dignity and self-determination. However, these rights are still not universally guaranteed, with laws varying by state and locality and regressive measures still being pursued. And
whereas, as a result of determined activism and advocacy, trans people now serve as religious and educational leaders, reach the highest level of athletic competition, star in film and television, and serve in prominent government positions, beginning to reverse many years of tragic exclusion. And
whereas in Philadelphia and across the country, trans people have courageously and powerfully organized in response to hate crimes and violence that have been directed at members of their community, especially at trans women of color, nonetheless receiving insufficient mainstream coverage and recognition. And
whereas we recognize and celebrate the work that is being done by trans advocacy groups to continue to fight for dignity and equal rights for members of the trans community, to build inclusive and healing spaces, and to protect and defend those who are most vulnerable, including people with disabilities and in prison, and
whereas, while Philadelphia has helped lead the way in extending non-discrimination protections and equal benefits to trans people, including trans youth in our school districts, the commitment is even more needed in the face of threats that the federal government will curtail or abandon its enforcement of civil rights protections and deeply cut health care and other crucial programs. And
whereas, in Philadelphia, we believe in the inherent value of each other, and every resident of our city, including especially our trans and gender nonconforming residents, without exception. Now, therefore, be it
resolved that on this last official day of Women's History Month, we have an expansive notion of what it means to be the fullness of our gender and our identity. The City of Philadelphia declares March 31st as Transgender Day of Visibility.
Excuse me. The chair recognizes Ms. Cooks for remarks.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I would first like to thank City Council for acknowledging the contributions of trans women of color and the LGBT community. I would like to thank the Office of LGBT Affairs for initiating this first step toward the acceptance of gender identity and equal rights that we have here in the city of Philadelphia. I think that there is a call to action that we need to have in our community that needs to be centered around the issues that we face daily, such as high amounts of HIV and AIDS rates, violence against transgender women of color in particular, as well as the poverty rates. There are trans people who are living below the poverty rate, about less than $10,000 a year, and that needs to change. So although this resolution, which I deeply appreciate, I would also like to extend to our city government officials conversations about how we can address some of these epidemics that we are not only facing in our city, but that we are facing in our Commonwealth and across the state. So thank you so much for welcoming us into your session and for acknowledging the contributions that we have had towards equality in our city, in our Commonwealth, and our nation.
Council Biddies.